Welcome to another Into the Astralands podcast. I'm your host, Eric Malachite. Today's guest is DC Wright-Hammer, and he's the author of the two-book series, BetweenTwo Mons. We're going to be talking about the book, its themes, and probably a lot more than that. DC, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yep, DC Wright-Hammer here. I grew up in Northwest Indiana, which is really like the industrial backyard of Chicago, for those who aren't familiar. Product of a housewife and a steel worker. I grew up in a fairly normal household, went to public school and a community college. I liked being creative at a young age. I started doing a little bit of writing of poetry and some short stories in high school. And life got in the way, went to college, got married, got a job. Then a few years ago, I got a few ideas in my mind to actually start writing a science fiction thriller series, and had no idea what I was getting myself into, but I just started writing, and one thing led to another, and before I knew it, I had something that seemed like I could publish. So
that's very interesting. By the way, nice last name. Is that your actual last name, Wright-Hammer?
So, funny story. My original, the colloquial term is the maiden name. I guess it doesn't necessarily apply to me, but I was just David Wright when I grew up. DC is actually my first name, middle initial, first initial, middle initial, and my last name is actually, I did hyphenate with my wife. She was Hammer, I was Wright, and we just brought them together. It made sense for us at the time, and it's a really cool last name. It's interesting. People used to make fun of either one of us because we had Wright and Hammer. Those are easy names to pick on. Since we've hyphenated to Wright-Hammer, people are more taken aback by it. So they see it and they're like, oh, okay. And then it was perfect when I needed a pen name, because it kind of stands on its own. So there you go.
That is awesome. But it's a great name. And I was sitting there, I'm like, is that his real name?
Yeah, it's legal. It's on the license. It's on the birth certificate, or not on the birth certificate. In fact, my dad was upset that I'm like, I didn't get rid of your name. I just added to it. But he, older folks tend to be a little more traditional. So, but it was something we wanted to do, something we were, we had no other reason to do it differently. And we'll see. Our children are named after us, so they know who the Wright side of the family is, who the Hammer side of the family is, and we'll go from there.
If I was a kid with a name like that, I don't think anybody would mess with me.
Yeah. It's funny. My son has 29 characters in his name. He's going to kill us when he gets older and gets tired of writing his name. My daughter only has 22, so she's got a little bit shorter of a name. She can handle it. But yeah, that last name, really, you get tired of writing it when you're like buying a car or buying a house or something like that. But it's worth it. It's something I feel like I earned. I don't know, men go into a marriage normally and they go by tradition, and for most people that's fine. We wanted to do things a little differently, so I feel like I've really earned a last name, which is odd, for men in Western culture to do things like that. And so I don't know, it's pretty interesting.
Very interesting. So tell me about this two-book series that you published. Was this the science fiction series that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so it was the culmination. I've always been a big sci-fi, somewhat of a nerd, somewhat of a geek, kind of floating on both sides, where I like the idea of, what's the next step for science? What's the next step for humanity, really, in technology and things like that. And so I did a little bit of reading. I was more of a movie buff, watching the Alien series, watching Terminator, watching Predator, watching all those movies growing up. And then seeing more psychological films, seeing like The Matrix, that are philosophical, and they've got, more of a societal critique built within them. And so I always had this idea for a series of some kind in mind. I didn't know exactly where I wanted to go with it. So around 2014, I was working as a data migration specialist, and I was moving data from one system to another for a day job. And I really enjoyed doing it. It was a fun job. And actually, right around that time, I experienced some pretty serious health issues that were very troubling, to the point where my mind started saying, well, I can think, like, my mind is still good, but my body is kind of in a bad place. What if I could just get my mind out of my body and put it in a good one? And so that started getting some of the creative juices flowing. And that came to be the Between Two Minds series is what I wrote, and it's been on Amazon for a year and a half or so. And it basically it takes a kid who's a paraplegic, he's in his early 20s, and he's saved for a decade, and he just wants to get in a body that's fully functional. His body has never done what he's wanted it to do. He's never been able to walk. He's always needed assistance with life. And so I basically took my situation that I had, and I wanted to put it in a spin that might be a little more relatable for some people. And so he's been a paraplegic his whole life, and he lives in the near future where they have this procedure where they can download your mind and they can upload it into a fully functional lab-grown body. On the face, that sounds, hey, that's a cool procedure, and everyone would opt for it. And in the future that I build, the world that I build, it's a common procedure. People that have cancer, people that maybe don't identify with the gender that they were born into, people that I try to put a limit on it. So I say if you're older than 35, you can't do the procedure. So that kind of rules out people living forever. But kind of going along those lines of if humans could transfer their consciousness, what would that look like? And so I build a series around, his name's Ryan Carter, the paraplegic, and what he experiences. He goes through this common procedure, and immediately after the procedure, he instantly starts experiencing weird visions, dreams they feel real to him. They feel you're basically looking through the eyes of another person. And so that's basically the beginning of Between Two Minds.
That's fascinating. Yeah, you don't exactly, in society, you don't want them to become Mets if you've seen Altered Carbon living for hundreds of years and what have you. That's been something that's always fascinated me about people who want to transfer their consciousness into a new body. What happens, is consciousness or even your mind something that can be transferred? Is it confined to your brain and your brain alone? That's where we get the brain in the jar argument versus non-local consciousness, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah.
So have you looked into non-local consciousness as a theory versus the brain in the jar? I mean, non-local consciousness is it's not really a quantum physics theory itself. It's more of an offshoot of different quantum physics ideas and theories that culminate into a group of people that believe that consciousness is non-local.
Right. Yeah, I think some of the more metaphysical stuff, some of the more it takes science to its limits, and to some extent I've seen it take some leaps, some hypotheses that might be leaps in some people's mind. In my series, I do try to give some science behind it. Obviously it is science fiction, so you take some liberties there. But the main character, his name is Ryan D. Carter, and that really is a play on Rene Descartes, which he did the evil demon, thought experiment, which turned into the brain in the bat, experiment, taking it to that next step. If a supercomputer could pretend to be our body, pretend to be the outputs of our mind, basically, you wouldn't know that you were not in an actual body if the supercomputer could pretend to be it for you. And so I pay homage to that in an actual chapter where the main character, he's in his new body, he's having these problems, and he's completely doubting everything that everyone's telling him. And his counselor, who is sort of a third party separate from the company that did his procedure, his old family counselor tells him, if you doubt, you think, and therefore you are. And so that's the actual quote, and people sometimes shorten it to I think, therefore I am. But the full quote from Descartes was, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. And I put emphasis on the doubt because I think that's important. If you can be aware that there's a possibility that you're not who you think you are, you're not where you think you are, there's some skepticism there. I think that goes a long way to saying that you are truly a conscious being. You truly do have, you're not destined to a certain outcome that you can doubt, you can think, and you can work your way through it. So I definitely touch upon a lot of that stuff, particularly in book one, to give it more of a philosophical spin.
That's very good. So, what about book two? When did you release book two?
Book two was released in October of 2018, so just a few months ago. Book one was really the story of Ryan, and there is a secondary character named Charlie, and so that's where you get your two main characters, and it's called the Between Two Minds series. Book two, I had to do a little bit differently, and without spoilers or anything like that. The goal was really to build the world that I had set out. Book one was it was first person point of view from Ryan's perspective, and it was really his journey from paraplegic in a futuristic automatic wheelchair. I call it an auto chair just for short, just to give it a name. And him going from that to embracing his new body is the way I'll kind of put it, with all its rough around the edges, the experiences that he has. Book two, we already know Ryan's character. We know how far he's come. And so I do take his story farther, but I also actually tell the story of how this whole procedure came to be. We often hear a scientist made a breakthrough and a company patented a procedure or something like that, and that's how we get to this next new medical breakthrough, things like that. You don't often hear things like, oh, there was this corrupt company, there was some sabotage, there was some people who didn't obey their commands. They did something on their own terms. They went rogue, and they might have taken advantage of this technology when they weren't supposed to and let it out of the bag too soon. They, I guess movies like books and movies like Jurassic Park talk about that, where companies push too fast and they get a little too, easy on the finer details, and that comes back to bite them in the end. So I try to play a little bit on some of those sci-fi, things that are tried and true that readers can relate to see, how did this procedure come to be? Where is our main character going? And how do those two things directly impact each other? I say the past, present, and future are on an unstoppable collision course in book two.
Well, that sounds fantastic. Okay, so here's more of a, not so much a question about the books themselves, but you hear a lot about indie authors talking about writing to market and specifically aiming for a 6-book series. So my question to you is, why just 2 books?
I've been writing for the last 3.5, almost 4 years, and that's as quick as I could turn out the 2. I don't have a 6-book series in mind. I see the potential for about 5 books in the series. And I've actually started on 2 more. Book 3, the direction I want to take it, I introduce a really significant main character in book 2, and I think she deserves her own book. And I also want to get back to the roots of the series from book 1. And so I'm actually going to basically write a book, book 3, which is actually going to be a prequel. And that's going to tell the story of the main character from book 2 that we introduced. And I actually wanted, so the whole purpose of the series is to not just tell a story, but also give the reader somewhat of a meta experience, make them do a little extra work. And so book 1, it was first person point of view, but every chapter alternated between the 2 main characters, and you had to sort of gather yourself at the beginning of every chapter and figure out who am I and where am I and what's going on. In book 2, for most of the book, you're actually between 2 times. You're following Ryan, the main character, as he moves the story forward, but you're also following the backstory of how the whole procedure came to be decades prior, and seeing how those 2 stories do eventually come together for the finale of the book. In book 3, I want to try to challenge my readers and challenge myself, and I've actually taken on a co-author for this book, and my goal is to have me and my co-author write every other chapter in our own voice, between 2 minds, literally, and challenge the reader. They're going to be reading 2 different authors, 2 different styles, 2 different ways of conveying information, and see if we can successfully put out a book that, is true to the series, is true to the characters that each one of us are going to write, but also is harmonious enough to say it's actually one book. It's actually tells one story, and, play with it throughout that whole third book. So it's going to be difficult. It's going to take a lot of work in editing and, a lot of compromise on both me and the co-authors, wanting direction we want to take things. But I think it's something that if we do it right can really set the series apart.
It's interesting you bring up having a co-author on one of these books, and for the longest time, I avoided books that were co-authored for some reason, and I'm not even sure why. I'm a huge Roger Zelazny fan. I don't know if you know who he is, or was rather.
Yep.
But he co-authored a couple books with other authors, and he and George R.R. Martin also created the Wild Cards anthology series. I've got the first volume on my shelf and I've yet to check it out. But I also recently picked up Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett's Good Omens, which I hadn't read yet. And my girlfriend's basically saying, well, that's kind of a deal breaker. So, but I heard amazing things about that. And I also have an author friend. He's been really urging me to collaborate with him on something very similar, to I write one chapter, he writes one chapter. So it's an interesting synchronicity that you bring that up. Not that it's a synchronicity, but you know what I mean. So you talk about how you were very imaginative growing up. What made you as you were growing up? Did you ever think that you would become a writer?
Yeah. So as a kid, I actually played a lot of sports. I played basketball, I played football, and I was fairly good at those. And my freshman year in high school, my English teacher actually pulled me aside and basically said that I was really gifted in terms of English and writing, and that I should continue to pursue that. He also did interesting word puzzles and riddles and different things like that to really try to confuse his students, try to tap into their problem solving sides. And so I think it was a combination of him taking interest in me, just, outside of sports. I was a jock, and that's the way a lot of teachers treated me. But he said, you don't have to just be that. And what's interesting is I actually have maintained a relationship with him all these years later. And he's actually read book one and reviewed it and said it was great, which was, you want those things to happen. When they do, you're just kind of just in awe because someone that you've looked up to forever, actually critiques your work. And, he took a red pen to many of my papers, but this was something that I had worked on for a while. So I think there's, and I actually spent a little over 5 years as a technology and engineering teacher. I think there's creativity in most children. I think that depending on, how they're brought up, depending on their, in some cases, income level, if they've got two parents, if they've got, other family members that are raising them, and just having someone like I had take an interest in them at the right point. Even after the English teacher took interest in me, I still didn't think that I would become a writer. It wasn't until, I was mentioning earlier, the culmination of a lot of things in my life, and writing was really an outlet. It was a way for me to, go into a fantasy world, but really deal with some of the things that were on my mind at the time. One of the themes in my first book is fatherhood. I had just become a new father, and it's a scary thing. And then I have health complications on top of that. And so you kind of read that in book one, that there's a lot at stake. Fatherhood, there's fathers that aren't around, there's fathers that are bad in the book. It's a theme that's not, overtly, I don't try to beat people over the head with it in the book, but it's there. If you look, my editor even said, you got the whole dad thing going on here. I'm like, that couldn't be farther from the truth, and try to joke with her. But she was really good at, pointing that out. And I said that was on purpose, even though I did it more than I thought I did. I think, the way children are raised and giving them the opportunity to be creative. I don't think enough children get that. And I think if they did, I think the world would be a lot better place. And I'm hoping that I can inspire young people, my children, and any other people that I get around to tap into that creative side.
Yeah, I definitely see what you're saying right there. I was diagnosed with ADD when I was very young, and my father refused to medicate me. And instead of sitting one-on-one with me, one of my teachers, I remember in grade school, just moved my desk to the wall and had me facing the wall away from the other kids. I'm like, that's kind of a good metaphor for how we deal with problems in the school system. We don't nurture these kids, I don't think. We don't cater to their special way of learning, because everybody, and I think boys are more physical learners. They need more spatial information than just having facts, barked at them. And it's actually been shown that, our way of drilling for exams isn't very effective for retaining information, and there's no deep connection that's made when you're doing that, especially with lectures.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can tell you right now, every single standardized test I've ever taken in no way, shape, or form helped me become a writer. In fact, it was probably the opposite. I think when I was a teacher and I would see kids that had either too much energy or, they just learned a little bit differently, I'd try to really look at them on a personal level and see, how can I connect with them? What can I do differently that other adults maybe haven't thought of, or maybe just were too impatient to try something new? I used to keep a lot of those metal physical puzzles where you have to break apart the different pieces, but you can't do it too aggressively or you'll bend the metal and break it. And I would actually walk over to some of, especially my boys who had too much energy, and I would hand them this metal puzzle, and they would be able to work on it and listen better than if they had nothing in their hands. And it was, I did it by accident at one time. I was just kind of frustrated. And I'm like, if this will keep him busy, maybe that's a good thing. But it ended up working out. And I started doing that with more students. And then suddenly the other kids wanted to be like those kids. Whereas, other teachers would punish or send them out in the hall or send them to detention or something like that. I looked for ways to keep them occupied. I would stand closer to them in cases, let them know that I was there. And I actually did recognize that they're, being a little disruptive or whatever it might be. But I think, what I did learn I was in 7th through 12th education, but I saw K through 12 that teachers, even the best ones, they're just worked to death. And even the best ones have to go above and beyond and really, do a really great job. And even then, some kids are going to slip through the cracks because, good teachers are just one person. You need really a whole support cast. And so, and that was kind of the reason why I had to go back into the private sector. I was a teacher for over 5.5 years. Then I have my son, and I had 130 kids during the day. And by the time I got home, I had nothing left for the one kid that I was legally responsible for, that I loved to death, and that I wanted to be a great father for. And so something had to give there. So yeah, definitely, interesting how education really plays a role in how people develop.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening to a different podcast, and they were talking about how this education system that we have now got started in the beginning of the industrial age. It was essentially designed, not my words, podcast words, to churn out factory workers. And that actually kind of makes sense to a certain degree with how many students are just allowed to fail, and they just socially promote them forward. Even when they tried in California to do away with social promotion, they kind of brought it back in a way, and with how they curve exams, do everything on a bell curve and what have you. It's not doing a lot of these kids any good.
Yeah, and the 5.5 years I worked were with inner city kids. It was a charter school, so they got a little bit of the somewhat of the better kids of the neighborhood that I was in. But a lot of these kids were, forsaken. A lot of kids, teachers would say, let's get them in, let's get them through the curriculum, let's get them out. And I really poured myself into it. It was an interesting class. It would look like chaos to a standard English class or math class where you hand out the textbook and the teacher gets up in front of the room and lectures. I was fortunate. I actually had a really neat technology lab. It was computer driven. They had modular learning. So they would learn about architecture for 2 weeks. Then they'd learn about laser technology. Then they'd learn about, we had forensic science. We had video casting, different things like that. And I would, train the kids on how to use the lab and instill them that it was their lab, that I am the, foreseer, that I just kind of run things, but it's really their lab. And, I had great success. I had kids who went on to engineering degrees, who otherwise might not have thought that engineering or technology was for them. A lot of kids nowadays can use, standard consumer technology, but I challenge them, don't just do that, take things apart, build things, think of something that doesn't exist and find things to put it together, make something new, make something different. And so it was a great experience to see, like I said, kids that you wouldn't, that might be looked over, that might be thought of as those who couldn't do it, and see just what they could do. Real quick story. In the first 2 weeks of school, I would hand them one sheet of computer paper, 6 inches of masking tape, and a pair of scissors, and I'd put them in groups, and I'd say, build me the tallest tower you can. And I'd give them a few other, it had to have 4 sides, and it had to stand up straight so it couldn't fall over. I'm like, build me the tallest tower you can. And they're like, how? And I said, I'm not going to tell you how. I want you to figure out how. And something as simple as that, giving them limited resources, putting them in a group. And I also scored them based on how tall the tower was. So the tallest tower got full credit for height. And then the next tower got 90% for height, and then 80%, and 70%. There was only 4 groups, so the lowest group could still get like a 70% or something like that. So I wasn't trying to fail anyone if they didn't produce the tallest. But you'd see, I would give the whole spiel, set up the whole project, and then I'd say, go. And these kids were focused. There wasn't like, nobody was being disruptive. Nobody was doing that. I wasn't standing up front telling them what to do. I set it up, told them to go. And I had one group build a 39-inch tower out of one piece. And I watched them because I had to watch them. I wasn't sure that it was one piece. But they built a 39-inch tower that stood long enough for me to measure it. And it was really neat to see creativity when I didn't tie behavior, I didn't tie grade, there was grades tied to it to some extent, but just to see what they could do when they were really put to the test.
Yeah, that's awesome. Honestly, I wish we had more teachers like that back when I was in high school and all of those different levels. Hell, even some of my illustration instructors could have had a lesson probably from you.
Yeah, well, I think it's really what are you in it for? And if you're in it for the people, I think it's easy to get through some of the politics, definitely economics, and I'm here for the people. I went to school for software development years ago, and I went to a C++ class, which is an ancient language nowadays, but the professor was this highly touted, very decorated professor. This was a 100 level course, and he came in saying, I am too good to teach this class, essentially. I can't remember the exact words he said, but he said, I'm too good to teach this class, so you guys are going to have to work really hard to impress me. Like, oh, okay. And then halfway through the class, I'm carrying a low C, and I'm probably going to fail if I keep going on this path. The guy's not explaining anything. I'm wallowing. So I withdraw from the class. I don't want to take that hit. So the next semester, I'm like, well, I have to get this class done. So let me take it again. And I specifically got a different professor. And miraculously, I got an A. This teacher was easygoing. He had just graduated. He, actually remembered what it was like going through a course like what he was teaching. And he really did go the extra mile to make sure we understood things. And that A, it was the same curriculum, but taught by a different person. And he was able to figure out a way to reach us.
What a difference. So let me ask you a question. When does the next book come out? When are you thinking it's going to be ready?
That's a question mark. I
I figured it
really,
might be.
right. Book one and book two were really one book in my mind, and I had to break them out into two for, it would have been too long. It would have, I could tell two separate stories effectively. So I wanted to do that. Book three, on the other hand, I got to the point where I'm like, okay, I told that story. I basically wrapped up what I wanted to tell from the beginning. In book two, somewhat of a spoiler, not really, but it ends on a cliffhanger. So obviously I have to pick up eventually. What I have committed to so far is to market the first two books. I really want to get, more readers. I want to get more reviews, and we all know that reviews are technically for readers, but I don't know an indie author that doesn't take a look at them and at least, see what's going on. They keep an eye on their rating. They keep an eye on, who likes it, who's reviewing it, and things like that. And so, and not only that, but local readers, just trying to get involved in the local library, more indie bookstores and things like that. I really wrote for, like I said, 3.5 years, and I didn't put as much time into marketing and building that readership. So I'm going to be doing that along with trying to figure out how to co-author a book. So I've authored a book, and that takes a certain set of skills, and I'm finding co-authoring a book takes a different set of skills to some extent. That there's a lot of compromise that has to be done. There's, in our case, it's not trying to write something that seems like one person wrote it. So we kind of have to make sure we maintain our own voices and not blur it together too much. So, so I'd say there's a question mark on when the next book's going to be released. And then, a writer problem that I have is I actually am about 60,000 words into a completely separate story outside of the series that I'm considering finishing and releasing. And so, we'll see. What's nice about being an indie author is that you get to choose where you put your effort. And so right now, between marketing and just dabbling in other works in progress and other things like that, we'll see where it takes us.
Right. Well, I know that problem, that indie author problem, quite well. I've got several of those. Well, that sounds fantastic. I can't wait to pick up at the first book. I think I'm going to do that at some point. Okay, so where can my listeners, your listeners, people listening to this podcast, find you?
I'm very active on Twitter, and that's just Twitter at DC Wright-Hammer. I do have that's DC Wright-Hammer 2 on Twitter. I actually had my personal account that I deactivated, started a new one, so I've got the 2 on there. So DC Wright-Hammer 2 at Twitter.
I was going to say, are you between minds?
Always and never. So I'm on Facebook at DC Wright-Hammer. Hammerstone Creative is the name of my website. And when I started a website, I didn't want it to just be for my authorship. I do some other creative works. I like to do video editing. I like to do audio editing to some extent. I don't think I'm a professional by any means, but I like to dabble. And so when I created a website, I wanted it to be a little bigger than just my, what I release as an author. So Hammerstone Creative. And I actually do on my website, I actually do an indie author spotlight. So I've been looking at the writing community and finding indie authors who want to be spotlighted. It's actually a free service that I offer on the website. And I just throw out a picture of them. They can give me a bio I'll put out there, what it means to them to be an indie author, a picture of their book, some links to their social media and where they can get their books picked up. So in between writing, I try to be a custodian or an assistant to the writing community itself.
That's fantastic. I was going to ask you next if you had to give anybody who's starting their indie author journey just now, maybe they're about to publish their book, maybe they're just writing it, what's the one piece of advice you would give them that's you've found crucial in your journey?
So spend a lot of time, coming up with your definition of success. I think it's very nebulous to somebody who just starts writing that, I'll write this and maybe I'll publish it. And maybe if I publish it, maybe I'll try to sell it. And maybe if I try to sell it, maybe it'll get big. But come up with some parameters as to where you're going to put most of your effort. And so if that's simply writing it and publishing it, maybe that's it. Self-publishing is a great way to get your work out there. And maybe that's all you want to do. Maybe you're not even interested in marketing. Maybe you don't want to go that far with it, but you just want to say that you've done something like that. That's a definition of success. And that could be someone's perfectly good definition of success. For others, they definitely want to get it out there. They want to market it. They want to sell it. And eventually, maybe for some people, they want to work full time as an indie author and they can live off of their royalties. And that's a great little dream of some people. Whatever that goal is, that definition of success, come up with it. It doesn't mean that it's the end all be all. It can change eventually, but work towards one at a time. Have those smaller goals and focus on them, because you can get pulled in a lot of directions. You can get pulled into the marketing direction where you spend gobs and gobs of time, possibly money, effort, coming up with ads, breaking your back trying to get that one book to that one person who lives, 40 miles away or something like that. I got to mail it to them. Oh, I can't mail it to them. Like, there's so many logistics behind managing your stock if it's paperbacks, or finding an audience for your book, different things like that. And then if you want to maintain a social media presence, that takes effort and time. People think you just get on, get a lot of followers and that's it. You actually have to interact. You have to be a person. You can't be like a bot, something like that.
You can't just be advertising your book every 5 minutes. People don't like
exactly. Spamming your book and or other people's book is not going to get you anywhere. And it's a waste of your time, and it's a waste of the Twitter sphere. I mean, I guess some people might sell a book here or two, but here or there by doing it. But the main thing is, again, developing that definition of success and working toward that.
All right. That's a fantastic answer, actually, and a unique one, too. Well, once again, where can they find your books?
So the books are, the ebook is exclusive through Amazon. So if you're going to get the ebook, it is for a limited time on sale for 99 cents on Amazon. Between Two Minds, Awakening is book one. Book two's $3.99 right now. So you can get the whole series as it stands for $5 now, basically. Paperbacks are on Amazon. You can get them at Barnes and Noble. You can get them at a few other places as well. And that's pretty much where they can get the books. And then, like I said, social media and my website, definitely people can reach out to me there as well.
All right. Okay. And it's the Between Two Minds series.
That's correct. Yep.
And it's Hammerstone Creative?
Yep. HammerstoneCreative.com.
All right. Well, it has been fantastic to have you on the show. And is there anything else you'd like to say?
I really appreciate the opportunity. But like I said, I'm trying to build a readership now. I'm trying to build myself up in the writer community. So I really appreciate this opportunity to do an interview. And it's been very great. So thank you.
All right. Well, you keep me posted on the development of that co-authored book. I'm very interested to see how that turns out too.
Yeah, I might have to do sort of a diary or documenting of how that goes. So I'll definitely keep you posted.
All right. Once again, big thanks to DC Wright-Hammer for coming on the show. I'm your host, Eric Malachite. Go ahead and feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and ring that bell because YouTube is stupid, and I will see you next time on the next Into the Astralands podcast. Just a quick heads up, my novel Echoes of Olympus Mons is currently available for pre-order on Amazon and will be releasing on April 11th of this year. I also created a street team for those of you who would like to read the novel before it comes out and review it on day one. Members get access to the Mobi and PDF file, and I may have a special deal including signed copies. Shoot me a message on Facebook for more details on that. Now, this does mean that members will have to buy a copy on day one in order for their reviews to be verified. If you're planning on picking up the book anyway, this is a great way to help spread the word and make this book launch as big as possible. To join, go ahead and follow the link in the description. Thank you so much.